Hello and welcome to an Inspector Calls Finish in 5. Now this is the third video on the third extract, so hopefully you've already listened to the first two. If not, the basic idea of this is, as previously, that by working through a series of around 5 or so extracts from the text, you'll get a sense of the whole text structure and what happens. And during each short video, as previously, we're going to cover what happens before the extract, why the extract matters, and also what happens as a result of the extract and afterwards. This is, once again, the third of the extracts, so do please go back to extracts 1 and 2 if useful. Okay, so in terms of what's happened so far in the play before the extract for today. Well, the Burlings were celebrating. The inspector arrived and announced the suicide of someone called Eva Smith. Burling was interviewed first about firing Eva Smith from his factory. Sheila was then interviewed about having Eva Smith fired from Millwoods, a clothes shop. And at the end of the interview with Sheila, the inspector dropped in that Eva Smith had changed her name to Daisy Renton. Gerald was startled, the stage direction told us. But there had been hints already. We found out near the beginning of Act 1 that Gerald had ignored Sheila for the whole summer, without really giving a satisfactory explanation. Gerald had asked to see the photograph when Sheila had been upset by it earlier in the play, and Gerald had been told by the inspector that it wasn't the right time, something that clearly unsettled him. Sheila, of course, spotted Gerald's reaction, and Gerald pleaded with her not to tell the inspector anything. But Sheila didn't need to. The inspector returned, and to the shock of the Burlings, apart from Sheila, asked Gerald about his involvement with Eva Smith. So Gerald, it seems, met Eva, now known as Daisy, in a bar. Now, in the extract we're about to look at, Gerald explains to the inspector and to the Burlings in the room about meeting Daisy Renton, as he knew her, and also about how he ended up in something approaching a kind of relationship with her. We hear about Gerald rescuing Eva from the unwelcome advances of one of Burling's friends, a man called Joe Meggerty. We learn about Gerald providing Eva with food, about drink and somewhere to live, and then also about the affair that he has with her. It's worth looking closely at how open Gerald is about his actions at this point, about how Gerald justifies his actions, and also about how we as an audience might interpret what Gerald did. Well, the girl saw me looking at her and then gave me a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help, so I went across and told Joe Meggerty some nonsense, that the manager had a message for him or something like that. I got him out of the way anyway, and then told the girl that if she didn't want any more of that sort of thing, she'd better let me take her out of there, and she agreed at once. Where did you go? We went along to the county hotel, which I knew would be quiet at that sad time of the night. We had a drink or two and we talked. And did she drink much at the time? No, she only had a port and lemonade or some such concoction. All she wanted was to talk, a little friendliness, and I gathered that Joe Meggerty's advances had left her rather shaken, as well they might. And she talked about herself. Yes, I asked her questions about herself. She told me her name was Daisy Renton, that she had lost both parents, that she came originally from somewhere outside Bromley. She also told me she'd had a job in one of the works here, and they'd had to leave after a strike. She said something about the shop, too, but wouldn't say which it was, and she was deliberately vague about what happened. I couldn't get any exact details from her about herself, just because she felt I was interested and friendly, but at the same time she wanted to be Daisy Renton and not Eva Smith. In fact, I heard that name for the first time tonight. What she did let slip, although she didn't mean to, was that she was desperately hard up and at that moment was actually hungry, so I made the people at the county find some food for her. And then you decided to keep her as your mistress. What? Of course, Mother. It was obvious from the start. Go on, Gerald. Don't mind Mother. Well, I discovered, not that night, but 2 nights later, when we met again, not accidentally this time, of course, that in fact she hadn't a penny, and was going to be turned out of the miserable back room she had. It happened that a friend of mine, Charlie Brunswick, had gone off to Canada for 6 months, and had let me have the key of a nice little set of rooms he had in Morgan Terrace, and had asked me to keep an eye on them for him and use them if I wanted to, so I insisted on Daisy moving into those rooms, and I made her take some money to keep her going there. I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. I made her go to Morgan Terrace because I was sorry for her. I didn't like the idea of her going back to the Palace Bar. I didn't ask for anything in return. I see. Yes, but why are you saying that to him? You ought to be saying it to me. Yeah, I suppose I ought, really. I'm sorry, Sheila. Somehow I know. Somehow he makes you. But she became your mistress. Yes, I suppose it was inevitable. I mean, she was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. I became at once the most important person in her life. You understand? So in terms of dissecting the extract, now despite Gerald's attempt to hide what he did, when confronted, he seems quite open about his actions. Gerald presents his first encounter with Eva Smith as a rescue from Joe Meggerty, and one initiated, he claims, by Eva Smith herself, with a glance that was nothing less than a cry for help, though there's no sense that he's ever tried to rescue any other woman in this bar. And he's already pointed out that Eva Smith is, of course, young and attractive, so we can't really help but question his motives. Gerald explains having taken Eva, Daisy as he knew her, to the county hotel for a drink, which sounds innocent enough. But it's interesting that he took her to a hotel, somewhere that serves food and drink, yes, and has rooms. It's also noticeable that Gerald buys Eva alcohol, and that's a symbol of corruption in the play, before finding out that she also needs food. Unlike the rest of the Burlings, there's a sense that Gerald listened to some of what Eva told him, although details are vague, and he doesn't seem to have really pushed or really sought information. The name issue comes up. Eva Smith, a name that links to her role as representing all women and all workers, Eva, all women, Smith, workers, has been replaced instead by Daisy Renton. And that's a name linked to a pretty but common flower, often viewed as little more than a weed, something fragile and temporary. But also a surname, Renton, that conveys the idea of being rented. Priestley here is offering the reasonably strong suggestion that there's an element of prostitution here. Gerald has access, of course, to some rooms owned by a friend of his, so he lets Daisy stay there and gives her money. Now, despite Gerald's claims that he was simply helping, he also describes the affair as being inevitable, since she was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful. And notice the order. It's Eva's, Daisy's, attractiveness and his power over her that makes the affair inevitable. And it's noticeable both that Gerald is ducking responsibility, inevitable, and that the relationship is on some level exploitative. She's weak, he's powerful. And we could well imagine a future Gerald turning into a kind of a Joe Meggerty figure in a few decades' time. Notice also that Gerald doesn't give Eva a job, something he could, but that of course would give her some measure of independence from him. As an audience, we end up with very mixed feelings about Gerald's actions. He rescued Eva, he helped her, he provided for her, and he didn't ask for anything in return. But he also exploited the weakness of an attractive woman. He took advantage of her need. He allowed the affair to happen. He was unfaithful to his fiancée. He kept the woman in question dependent on him deliberately because it made him powerful. And he also attempts to deny responsibility for his actions. Now, unlike Burling and Sheila, there's something very, very personal about Gerald's actions towards Eva. He takes away her independence, and the impact that he has is both physical and emotional. In some ways, it's far more significant and far more damaging than the actions of the earlier characters. So in terms of what comes next after the extract, well, Gerald then denies being in love with Eva Smith, but he also acknowledges that she had feelings for him. When the relationship becomes inconvenient for him, Gerald ended things and gave her some money, making little effort, it seems, to make sure that she was all right afterwards. In a sense, Eva was given a taste of like a middle or even an upper-class lifestyle with a man that she loved, but then had all of it taken away, and that's perhaps even more of a fall than when she was sacked from the factory or from the clothes shop. Gerald seems genuinely upset by what happened and the revelation of her death, and Sheila, unaggressively, gives Gerald back the engagement ring. Now, although Gerald's actions are questionable, his distress and the fact that he did help and did make Eva Smith happy encourage us to forgive Gerald somewhat. Even the inspector later acknowledges that Gerald had some affection for her and made her happy. And that's perhaps also why Gerald's later failure to see the seriousness of his actions or to change is all the more disappointing. And just to finish off, a quick reminder, don't forget all those other resources that are available to you. There's your recipe books, the quotation cards, there's the Net English One website with those hundreds of videos, including loads on Inspector Calls. There's the daily quotation, which is on the Net English Twitter feed. There's also the text guide and Inspector Calls, which is available from teachers or from your academy websites. And of course, a whole lot of podcasts covering pretty much every possible aspect of an Inspector Calls. Right, thank you for listening. That's the end of our third little video on our third extract, and hopefully I'll see you for number 4.